So everyone, welcome Ward Churchill and Matt Meyer.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, all of you, for coming out. I guess I want to start by saying this, just to be clear about my position here and maybe our positions here. Some folks in the War Resisters and Fellowship of Reconciliation circles, and maybe some other related, wondered if we were going to do a debate tonight, and we are absolutely not going to do a debate tonight. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but I'll say the first one most clearly. Though we may approach certain things a little bit differently, Pacifism as Pathology may not have been a book I would have written, and some of what I've written about revolutionary nonviolence is not exactly what Ward might have written. But the last time we spoke together, we were joined actually by a couple other people, including our mutual friend, former Black Liberation Army political prisoner, Sekou Odinga, former political prisoner, not former Black Panther and BLA supporter. And Sekou says, and has always said, that we are very good in the U.S. at finding reasons not to work together. And that we need to be much better at finding reasons to work together. And I think that's something that Ward and I have done in our own lives and our own practice, from supporting, continuing after decades, the support for freedom for Leonard Peltier, for all political prisoners, but also working to bring down the filthy, rotten empire that we live under and in the shadow of. So there's no debate here amongst us, and there's no major contradiction here. And though some may want to debate him, I just want to pay some honor and respect and real pleasure at being sitting here with you and working this evening together.
It's mutual.
Thank you, sir. So having said that, I just want to say a little bit about this purposefully, provocatively titled book that just came out. This is actually the first evening that this is being presented, and it's out in time for a major launch this coming weekend here in the Philly area at Arcadia University with the person, Sonia Sanchez, who graciously provided the foreword. We call this book White Lives Matter Most. And we didn't call it that because it's an aspirational title. We called it that because we thought it was historically accurate. We called it that because we think at this moment, questioning the validity, the intensity, or the degree of the ways in which white supremacy are pervasive throughout the empire is no longer useful. Battling against it and figuring out the multiplicity of strategies and tactics we need to use to work against it is what's on the table. And you'll notice I've said a couple of times the word empire, not country or nation or America, because when I say America, I'm talking about from Canada to the south of Chile and Argentina. And to me, even just understanding this space as an empire is one of the prerequisites at this moment for doing some clear, sharpened and focused organizing at a time when I think organizers of the left, organizers of progressive movements, organizers for effective, lasting social change at this moment of crisis, we need to sharpen our words and our actions. And because a member of the publishing group is in the room, I am going to do the obligatory reading a little bit from the book so that I can say, if you want more, you go to the back and buy the book. We must move beyond the myth about what the U.S. is and what it can be. It may be true that some reforms are both good and necessary in the struggles against racist police violence and mass incarceration. It may be true that we must fight the good fight to push back the vicious privatization of education, healthcare, and community services that make clear that the U.S. is not committed to democracy or justice for all. But it is surely also true that America is doing more than simply locking up people of African descent at a rate reminiscent of apartheid South Africa. America is doing more than warehousing political prisoners, especially from the Black Liberation Movement, Black Panthers, and others, for 30, 40, 50-plus years of torture behind bars. If we understand that racism is a combination of prejudice plus power, and that power comes from concrete structural sources, most especially land and capital, then we must face the institutional realities of white supremacy well beyond interpersonal dynamics. It is clear that if we are to examine the history of the U.S. from before 1776 till today, from south to north and Hawaii to Puerto Rico, from occupied Mexico to what some call New Africa, if we are to look at the U.S. less as a nation and more as an empire, an imperial power in deep economic decline, if we're to look sharply at the empire we live in, we cannot help but conclude that the United States of America is a prison house of nations. That's why it's been so hard to move beyond the historical calls for new ways to engage in struggle. That's why, when the cry Black Lives Matter was proclaimed, so often we heard the confused retort, but don't all lives matter? To this we must simply and clearly say, America has always meant white lives matter most. From the genocidal policies of the Middle Passage and Manifest Destiny, America has always meant white lives matter most. From the days of Jim Crow lynching to the police Klan realities of blue cap by day, white hood by night, America has always meant white lives matter most. When we learn today that some prisons in the Deep South are being built at a rate directly proportional to the schools in standardized tests, directly proportional to the low test scores obtained in predominantly black public schools in standardized tests administered to 3rd and 4th graders, we know that America still means white lives matter most. America has always meant white lives matter most. I'm going to end here because I want to engage in conversation, but I want to thank you all for being here, for engaging in the struggle against white supremacy and imperialism, and again, I want to say a word of honor and thanks to Ward Churchill. Take it away.
Sure. We're in Philadelphia. We're in a bookstore, and it's an honor to be in this bookstore. Never been here before. Heard about it, but I have never been here, so that's a pleasure and an honor. But there should be another kind of honor involved. But let me put y'all locals, yeah? Anybody not from Philadelphia here?
Originally, no.
Okay. Well, by and large, you locals, whose land are we on?
Yours?
Not mine. I do know what you mean, but more specifically. Thank you. I asked that question another bookstore in Pittsburgh night before last, and not a soul could respond. There was one native guy in there that wouldn't even identify as such until afterwards came up and thanked me in my own language for having been there. So, weren't you here when I greeted people? Yeah, but I live here. I don't make a deal of it. Wow. He just wrote a book right then, right there. Matt pointed out, we have no contradictions. Okay, we have points of disagreement, struggle, but actually those end up being compatible in certain ways. I'll take the short book, the 30th anniversary one first, in kind of a soundbite fashion. I've been active, seriously, since 1969, unless you want to count Vietnam, because I could say I was active there too, but I start counting when I got back. So you're looking really January of '69. I made my bones as an activist. And Fred Hampton always gets credit for the Rainbow Coalition, having put that together. It was actually Bobby Lee and Henry Gaddis. You don't hear those names so much, but engineered the whole thing, which is a coalition between Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, former street gang, becomes the Young Lords organization, a fragment of the old SDS Join project on the near north side called Rising Up Angry. Now, I could tell you a story sometime about how that name came into being, because it's not nearly what it sounds like. Kind of a joke in a way. And a group of displaced Appalachian whites that had gotten organized first by Join and then by themselves, called the Young Patriots. All right. And we had Northside Indian Center and some others involved. I was working more downstate. But given the longevity of that and the fact that I have never been willing to endorse, put my signature to a pledge of nonviolence, I believe in armed struggle, and I've participated in armed struggle, and having been active for all those years, probably 95% of all the things I've been engaged in would qualify by any definition of practical utility as nonviolent. The premise, however, is a proper analysis of the structure of power we confront is that when the rubber meets the road, the guns come out, and they got the guns. Okay, you're not going to persuade that into a different configuration. You're not going to change your diet. You're not going to build better bike paths. You're not going to do a petition campaign or the most persuasive moral argument in the history of humanity. Yeah, I mean, we can't call these people genocidal maniacs and totally unconscious of morality and make moral arguments and think we're going to change things. We're not going to speak truth to power. Power already knows the truth of what it's doing. We need to speak it to one another. And the truth I would speak in that regard is that in a relative state of disempowerment, you never foreclose any tactical option open to you. All right? There's no purity in picking up the gun. There may be a utility, there may be a necessity, but it's not, I'm pure because I engage in armed struggle. And that's the only thing I consider viable struggle. And the reverse of that is equally true.
Good. Agreed.
Equally true. There's no purity at issue, okay? If it's a thing about purity and moral standing and whatever, go to church. Okay? It's not therapy either. All right? It's political engagement. It's as serious business as the people with guns will acquaint you anytime you start becoming effective enough to bother them.
Amen.
Yeah. That's the short book. The long book, well, it's the second of a series of volumes that take essays in decades, wielding words like weapons. The title sort of speaks truth to you. That's the intent. Words, as Justice Scalia once put it, I agreed with him on something. Okay, words have meaning. Use them correctly. Right? Pay attention. But the subtitle is what's really at issue, which is Selected Essays in Indigenism. This particular volume at issue would be 1995 to 2005. There's an earlier volume from a Native Son that's being retooled for re-release, and then there's a follow-on volume that goes 2005 to 15, and I'm still breathing regularly, and I'm obsessively typing footnotes, so I guess I'm underway for a fourth volume. Good Lord willing, creek don't rise, is that how the saying goes? Yeah. But indigenism. is the key word there. And what is it? It actually fits into what Matt was saying, but in a very particular way, which is we have an overwhelming surplus of issues to deal with. But a key one that he was talking about was anti-imperialism, and understanding that that is a framework, a paradigm for understanding our situation in North America, not just out there somewhere. Okay? And the absolute bedrock of it, upon which all the rest of this is built, is the conquest, colonization of the indigenous nations of North America. Nations, and recognized formally by the United States as such, internally colonized within the United States. Every square inch of the land upon which the United States has been constructed is indigenous land. Some of it was by agreement, voluntarily, if you will, alienated. So it's not that it's none of it legitimately in the hands of non-Indians. Okay? But the preponderance of it was not. And the resources with which the U.S. has constructed its economy, and by the way, slave labor, but that's antecedent to the United States. Very little discussed, but the first slaves that were being taken in the slave trade was built off indigenous people here in North Carolina and so on. And transatlantic slave trade began in Hispaniola going the other direction. We need to cognate these things. But where I go with that is, let's imagine that all of the isms and theologies that we confront, that we understand, we must confront, transcend, transform into the antithesis themselves. And I'm talking about sexism and militarism and racism and classism and ageism and homophobia, and you know the list as well as I do. If you took a deep breath, closed your eyes, imagine for a moment that you had managed somehow the alchemy of unity, combination of ingredients had conspired, coagulated, come together in such a way that all of those had been addressed and transformed in a way in which we could be mutually comfortable, unless the issue of First Peoples, indigenous peoples, their rights to land, to sovereignty, to the resources of the land, self-definition, self-determination, all of that. So long as that had not been addressed as a priority, you would still have an internal colonial imperial structure, and the nature of the relations of that oppressive reality would be such that you would replicate all of the isms and ologies you just defeated. So, first people, first priority. To say first priority is not to say the only priority, obviously. We don't relate to other humans in our traditions the way this predatory culture that has come in and engulfed the continent do. Nor do we relate to the environment in that way. But this is a much longer conversation than we have time for tonight. That sketches out the sort of framework or paradigm from which I advanced the essays in those volumes. So you got them both, and I'll shut up now so that, as he said, we can do a little mud wrestling or whatever.
We could just ask each other questions. I know we could do that.
Just like that.
Do you have one? All right, start us off, please.
You spoke at the beginning, right, about how you were not here to have a debate.
Right.
I'm not disappointed by that at all. I think it's wonderful. But, you know, oftentimes you'll hear criticism within the left saying that what we should be doing is, rather than seeking unity with the tiny number of people in this shop, or this bookstore, we should be seeking unity with people who aren't in this conversation. How do you think of, responses like that? I mean, how do you avoid being in a situation where it seems like you're only speaking to people who are, 3 inches to the left of you, or, you're this little tiny circle, as opposed to the broader world, out there?
Let me start by making a confession or two, and I'm also going to not resist just responding to and underlining something Ward said, which I thought was particularly important, given this nonviolence, violence, and the ethical question. So I am not fundamentally coming from political work since I was 17, 18, from a faith base. That confession is rendered to you as the co-chair of the largest, longest interfaith peace group in U.S. history. One would think that the co-chair of the Fellowship of Reconciliation was primarily faith-based, and I'm confessing to you that I'm not. There are a variety of reasons, because of my decades working at a certain level within certain circles of nonviolence and radical nonviolence and my writing work, that I was elected to that position a year ago, and that I'm continuing it, and that I'm proud to do it. But to me, having that conversation with those folk is different than talking to a bunch of anti-imperialists who are all about political prisoner work. I have to confess, I just got a phone call, and Malev here is looking up the phone, and the speaker is off, so no one saw it, hopefully. But it was a phone call from David Gilbert,
Okay.
who's actually one of the last remaining white folk in prison for taking up arms against the empire and doing work in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Part of the Weather Underground and SDS and all of these organizations. David's a dear old friend. And it's an easy and very typical practice that folks involved in political prisoner work kind of work together. And they don't even talk to folk who are deep in the Native American indigenous communities, even folk who have long-standing work with Leonard. And they certainly don't talk to folk who are doing faith-based work that are peaceniks. So I think the call to preach beyond the choir is not just about talking to our opposites, but are looking at the broad circle of people who are potentially in our midst, who are 1 step or 2 steps away, 1 block or 2 blocks, 1 town or 2 towns, literally and figuratively away, and having that conversation. It is as if people really want the debate. People are hungry for the lots of splits that we have. And we're not so hungry. We're hungry for the unity. We're hungry for the concrete campaigns. We're hungry for this statement, which to me typifies the point about revolutionary nonviolence or a revolutionary perspective towards a multiplicity of tactics. The idea that both extremes have had problems and need to do away with the creation of new religions out of armed struggle or out of nonviolence is spot on. To me, what, Ward, you said about that is perfect. And certainly I spend a certain amount of time with folks who not only have their own faith bases, be they Catholicism or a certain type of radical Methodist, be they Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist, but this belief that nonviolence is somehow an ethical, spiritual, philosophical, full-blown way of life, which it may be for some people in some ways. But at this moment, in a movement to end or to turn back right-wing populism and assaults, we need to understand that nonviolence can be strategically and tactically used as a tactic, as a tool, and not as a religion. Similarly, the idea that the only way we can make substantial social change is through armed struggle undercuts what Ward just said about the fact that 95% of what he was actually engaged in was in fact unarmed. Nonviolence is a poor word for it, but nonviolence is a poor word. And so I think for us, the preaching beyond the choir is about, words have weapons, it is about being sharper. When we talk about revolution, we're not talking about a tactic or a strategy. We're talking about whole systems that need complete radical change. And though all revolutionary movements are built with a number of reforms, it may be time for us to challenge some of our reformist work and see what their long-term goals are. That conversation is really not being had in a strategic way by any of us, within or outside of the choir.
There's two things, directions. I want to tie into what you just ended up with, and then go back a little earlier. The way colonialism is understood, and it's accurate as far as it goes, is it's the imposition of one, well, in these cases, upon other nations. You can call it a nation on a nation, but most of the imperial powers are not nations as I would define them. They're compulsory amalgamations. They're internally colonized. They colonize themselves to become what they were capable of doing. Okay, they impose themselves for reasons of profit, strategic interest, whatever. So land is at issue in terms of the classic or overseas model, and there's internal colonialism and settler state colonialism as well. But still, the framing is sort of a materialist framing. What's really key to understand is that there was also epistemological colonization. There are various, you can block them out. If you're going to talk about Europe or the West, for example, you can block out whole alternative vectors that get obliterated by virtue of colonial imposition. And the colonists are always good at schooling people to see themselves and the world in accordance with colonial need. Okay? You can step outside the box altogether. And that creates a whole different way of viewing what our situation is and what it is that we need to do, what we're obliged to do, what we have every right to do. Other than we don't usually, in the epistemology of North America, talk about rights, we talk about responsibilities. So returning nominal independence to something that was created by colonialism and perpetuating that is not decolonization, it's continuation of colonialism. And that's a lot of what is subsumed under the so-called post-colonial discourse. Post-colonialism could only be in place if colonialism was over, and it's far from it. The other piece is, apart from how we might talk to one another, we spend, in my estimation, and always have, spent far too much time talking to one another. And that's a problem. But it's not just the people running for the exits, it's the people who never came in the door. How do you get to them? And my answer is, it's been used to pretty good effect. And I learned it from an organizer in Chicago named Mike James that's still at it in a way. He was a member of Rising Up Angry and joined. And his way of working with the younger people, they didn't know a damn thing about auto mechanics and such, but they were gearheads, and so he went down and helped them build a race car that they called Rising Up Angry and took up the US 30 drag strip. Now that's kind of antithetical to, well, we're doing political work as opposed to encouraging these guys to waste their time. No, go to where they are. Recognize that they have talents and aptitudes and interests, and maybe they'll reciprocate by being a little bit interested in what you're coming from. I've done that repeatedly, context after context, and it always works. Problem being, that practice has been kind of contingent on me. as it was in Chicago, being contingent on Mike. As soon as the individual pulls out, okay, nobody's going to pick it up. They go back to talking to one another and trying to figure out what the most politically correct position would be and what the priority issue would. The priority issue is to be able to reach people. See, so we need to stop coming back to religion again, approaching those who might be organizable if they were approached properly, respectfully, even though you might not really respect what it is you think they represent. Okay? Rather than coming at them as preachers, telling them what it is you think they need to know before you even get invited to sit down and have a cup of coffee. See? That's one facet of it, but I think it's an important one. I used to tell me, never take a paradigm for granted. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know? I've learned some things along that line that I didn't expect to learn.
You know, there's something you said towards the end of it, and it speaks a lot also towards practice, if I may. Ward is one of the people who, if you ask him to speak somewhere, he'll say, well, if it fits in the calendar and I can drive there and you can give me some money for gas, I'll go. He doesn't ask who it is, what their political line is, or even how much they're going to pay him. If he can get in the car and speak, he's going to go.
Institution.
Well, I mean, it's not stupid, but nonetheless, that openness speaks to a certain thing, because there's a word that we have for talking in this way to people and having that approach towards the work. That word is organizing. That's what it is. And of course, you know, the great Kwame Ture, you know, said there are three basic things you have to do once you understand the needs and the politics of the moment. Organize, organize, organize. And we have lost that in many respects. Sometimes it's as simple as, you know, just going down the block, knocking on the door of someone who you don't know, and saying, here, I think this is an important thing that I, your neighbor of 2 doors down, think, and I think you should know about it. I mean, not only do we not do something as simple as basic as that, we barely send an email that speaks that, like, emails are almost too complicated. Like, if we don't have, like, that picture for a millisecond and we can somehow heart it or, you know, whatever, organizing is about that kind of speech, that kind of conversation, that kind of commitment to try to build. And we are losing, and I think have lost a piece of it. I want to say one other little tag-on thing about the violence, nonviolence, because otherwise I'm going to forget it, and I think it's one of the, I don't know, it's one of the sweeter things. When we first had this conversation, and I said, you know, this is interesting, because what you're saying sounds really close to what I've been writing about as well. And then you have this book that's, you know, talking about, like, mental illness. And Ward, you said, look, the book isn't called Pacifism is Pathology, it's Pacifism as Pathology. And I just love that, and I wanted to share that here.
Yeah, it's framed in terms originally notes on an American pseudo-praxis, okay, pretending to be. Yeah.
Isn't organizing about having specific goals and then letting them come together in some sort of network? I mean, you don't talk about tactics in the abstract. I mean, we can have an endless discussion about violence versus non-violence, and I'm from India and we are having that discussion there all the time, as you can imagine, with the nonsense that has been fed for a long time about non-violence, which disguised so much violence, and, you know, let that continue. But the thing about organizing is that it's not just an abstract thing of, you know, we have to reach the people and we can knock on our neighbor's door. With what? And so what is the, you know, what do we have to do right now? What is the, I mean, I take it that everybody here is some sort of political being. So it's not as if the basic conversation is about whether we should go and do something, but I think the impasse right now is, what should that something be that captures the imagination and brings together people who do believe something should be done and are probably doing something in their own little way, but how do you come together and think about the systemic change that you guys are talking about? So I think you should talk about that. Yeah.
We're talking to one another again. How do we
Exactly.
bring the people who are already active and think they have a conception of where things need to go? How do we bring them together?
Yeah,
Okay, that's an issue. That's an issue.
that's the issue.
No, it's not the issue.
I
The
agree.
issue is how we get beyond this minuscule circle of people that you're talking about. You need to find out what the people who are not active in these ways in the community think the issues are in terms of their own lived experience. And you only get that by going and listening to them, not telling them you need for your
I know,
own
but
good.
you need an organization or something to do that. Otherwise, what we are saying is we should all disperse and talk and listen to the people, which is also an abstraction. And we've been hearing about that for generations.
It's not in the
people out
neighborhood
there.
where you're
of
working.
course it isn't, but
It is not in the
I mean, that's like
neighborhood
saying we
where
should just-
you are working.
okay.
I guess
disagree, I
what I want to I'm trying to figure out where I stand in this. I guess the clearest thing I can say is that I think it's a fantastic question, and I wish I had a fantastic answer. And I don't want to be. I mean, I want to get a little giggle, but I want to address it because I think it is serious and significant and also very, very difficult. I think if it wasn't difficult, we'd have it, and it would be there and clear to all of us. So let me reflect on it seriously because I think it's a serious question. I think that there are two pieces that you said about the concrete, because you're talking about the concrete, that these abstracts, be they strategic or tactical abstracts, or be they political abstracts, are in fact not so much what we need as something concrete. If I'm hearing it correctly. Let me go a little further here, and then you can correct me or filter in. So I think there are two concretes, or two ways in which you can look towards the concrete. One is through an organization, as you've said, and the other is through a campaign, which is not quite an organization, but at least is a framework for work. I'm going to speak to the second one first, and then I'll speak to the organization question. I think for some of us, I'll admit for a little bit myself, there looked like possibly, there was going to be a bottom-up, grassroots, multi-tendency, multi-generational, diverse campaign that had some shot at doing what you're talking about. And that was the framework that was flowing up about 6 months to a year ago, called the Poor People's Campaign. I thought that there was some cleverness about the 50th anniversary flip. I saw for myself times when the key spokesperson, Reverend Dr. William Barber, would go into different locations, both left and progressive and liberalish, and fire them up, not talking about electing this one or that one, but talking about civil disobedience and this and that. And so I have to say I had, hope is perhaps the wrong word, but I was interested in seeing where that would develop, insofar as I thought that campaign had a possibility of creating a rubric, a framework for connecting the dots around the multiplicity of issues that we are facing, the we being the big we, the people kind of we. I have to say, having been close to the center of that in some ways, and having gone through it and been arrested with Dr. Barber on the opening day and at other times, and been, for FOR's point of view, an organizational sponsor, I can't honestly say is how I think that hope has borne fruit. I'm not saying it never can or it never will or it won't, but I'll say that I think when we're talking about movement, when we're talking about movement building, there's something else.
Saying, how do we brainstorm to actually find something that is both very basic, and I take it that both of you are raising those questions, right? We have other, and at the same time captures the imagination of several generations of people, rather than being divided generationally, which I do think that both these movements had the power to do, whether they actually did it or didn't, but I think emotionally, And similar questions are happening elsewhere in the world, so it's not unique. I think we are at a particularly difficult moment where there are huge movements even, but they're kind of floundering as to how to go to the next step. So my question was not how to reach the people in a everyday sense, but how to make sure that even people who want to be there, and don't know where to come out to. And I think that's the impasse that I'm sharing.
Yeah.
Not,
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I want to tack one more thing on, which maybe is a little closer. I started by saying I didn't disagree with you that this was important, but it's not the only important thing. And part of the shift, I think, when I started, the signifier of honor or whatever that you were serious was you were an organizer.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that anymore.
That's right.
You're an activist.
That's right. That's
You
right.
go and you act.
That's right. That's right.
And then you go home.
That's right.
And you look at the way the structure was built in the 60s, and it ends up getting kind of squandered in
That's
the
right.
70s because we lost track of some things.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what we lost track of was in organizing events and mass movement turnouts and not having the analysis. Okay, it's sort of, in a way, what we're talking about with the sudden surge and then fizzle with Occupy. And for that matter, you got a hardcore or stable datum or whatever in Black Lives Matter that's carrying it forward, but that surge crested and dropped off pretty fast.
Yeah.
SNCC had a articulable vision, okay, that was somewhat deceptive. Everybody knows what I'm talking about with SNCC,
Student
right?
Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Yeah. Voter registration stuff was what they focused primarily on. And that was going out and organizing in individual communities among disenfranchised people to get them to the polls. And that's Black Power, right? That was the initial articulation of Black Power. Greenwood. Okay? Stokely meant more than that. Kwame Ture later, but still Stokely Carmichael
Right.
in those days. And he told me along about 1980, and I'm sure he said this in public settings and elsewhere too, but this is in personal conversation. He said, look, I've been arrested 38 times and gone to jail, gone Parchman Farm over the right of black people in Jim Crow states to vote, and I've never voted in my life. I don't believe in voting. It doesn't solve anything. But the point, as he articulated it very well, was that people are being pressed down and told no about something like that, which is symbolic. If you can give them the sense that they don't have to take no for an answer, if you can organize them to, okay, it's not going to be no, I have a right and I'm going to do it. That's empowering.
Mm-hmm.
Now where do you take it?
Yes.
Well, that's
Yes.
where it kind of got lost, you know.
Yes, exactly.
The votes came in, and at the time he was talking, he said, we got more black elected officials in cities, state governments, and so on, right now at this moment, than the rest of the history of the United States combined. And black people are objectively worse off today than they were in 1965. Okay?
Yeah.
We had a revolutionary vision, and we were marching resolutely, using this process of empowerment towards a greater thing, and then all of a sudden I looked around and I was the only one there. Okay? And Julian Bond was in office, and Marion Barry was in office, and John Lewis was in office, and that's not why we did this.
Yes.
Yeah?
That's right.
So, those two pieces you're talking about really do have to fit together. We have to have some concrete base, the way Eddie Conway's going at it in Baltimore, and there's others that I could talk about.
Beautiful.
Empowering the community. Okay, there's your base. Okay, but nobody can actually do that kind of organizing, organic in a community on a national level. But we got to restore organizer to its proper status as opposed
Beautiful.
to activist.
Beautiful.
Yeah?
Thank you, Matt. Good evening. My name is Hassan Foy Nkrumah Toure, and I'm very happy to be amongst my comrades here I've known for several years, Matt and Ward Churchill. I first want to beg you back off my comrade's comment here, what you said about organizing, and what you said about the Poor People's Campaign. Now, Matt, I think you know where I'm going here.
I'm happy to have you go there.
Okay. So, this year did mark the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. But unfortunately, we had dueling Poor People's Campaigns, one of which was funded and directed by the Democratic Party. No disrespect to Reverend Barber, I've heard him preach, been in his church, you know, he good with that. But when you look at the resources that were put into Reverend Barber's Poor People's Campaign, my former housemate in Washington, D.C., who has a over 30-year history of organizing against the Democratic Party, wound up taking a job for being paid about $40,000 to $42,000 a year to work on their campaign. I'm just saying. Now, my struggle here is that I think when we talk about organizing a movement, we have to talk about how we're going to fund our movement. Who is going to give it political direction, and who we depend upon for whatever resources we need to have that movement. Reverend Barber and them had money from all kind of foundations, the nonprofit industrial complex, philanthropists, every kind of thing. On the other hand, the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign here in Philadelphia, which is led by Sherry Honkala and others across the United States, we didn't have those kind of resources. People volunteered their time, donated money from their welfare check or their unemployment check or their disability check or money they borrowed or they maxed out a credit card. That's how we did that and had a walk from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. And they got harassed in one of the parks in D.C. for trying to have an event in the park, even with a permit. And then to be basically pushed aside on the internet and people going into our what is it called, the thing where you look up information? Wikipedia, thank you. Our page gets mysteriously erased or what have you. Now, I'm just simply saying that in the times that we're in now, these kind of things are important. Who's going to fund and lead the movement? Where are the resources going to come from? Where will the political direction come from? Because after all that happened with the walk from Philadelphia to D.C., Reverend Barber comes several months later. He had a little thing with former Vice President, what's his name?
Core.
No, other one. Pretty boy. Climate change guy. Al Gore.
Gore, Al Gore.
Al Gore. Al Gore. Mr. Mass Incarceration.
Yeah, him.
So how does that happen? You're talking poverty and a poor people's campaign when a lot of people who have been to prison or been to jail cannot get a job. They can't buy a car, can't rent an apartment, can't get student loans. They're more likely to be further impoverished and stay there. So these kind of contradictions do have to be talked about and worked about. And there are some times we're not going to be able to work with some people. And we have to admit that and keep it moving.
Thank you.
So why
Indeed.
you ask me that?
Indeed.
And I'm not trying to be funny, but this is a serious political question.
Yes, absolutely.
And good people got hurt
Absolutely.
in that process.
Yes.
Because they were not told the truth about how this is going to work.
Yeah.
So we have those kind of questions to grapple with, right? And we have to find a way to do that that's honest with everybody who wants to be involved. Secondly, Ward, I want to ask you about, when I was coming on my way over here, I was thinking about we have this Me Too movement now, right? But we have all these indigenous women who have turned up missing, raped, murdered, what have you, and for reasons that we probably know, they're not, those kind of situations are not getting the kind of public attention that it should. given how long this problem has been going on.
Yeah.
So if you have any updated information about those kind of campaigns in Native communities, that would be helpful too.
Well, the major campaign around that's based out of Vancouver, so it's in Canada. You got one route in British Columbia where you got 138 dead women, all Aboriginal women as they're called there, okay, from different peoples, but yeah, they've all been murdered along that stretch of highway and there's no leads. Our CMP simply can't come up with any leads, they say, which is it's not a priority. One could, as been suggested up there, suggest maybe the RCMP itself is responsible for some of these. But yeah, it's been publicized. It's not secret. You can find it on all of these information superhighway machines that Gore was talking about. It's there. No one really cares. I'd take it a little further. Okay. And narrow it down too. We can narrow it to not necessarily murder in a direct sense, although truncated lifespan could be construed as such. Alright. Me Too. I agree on the framing of the issue. Anybody besides me notice that every single person involved in Me Too as an icon, as a representative case, happens to be in an elite position? I mean, the woman working flipping burgers at McDonald's isn't exactly having clandestine meetings in his hotel room with Harvey Weinstein. But you got a whole strata, mass of women out there that are and have historically always been considered by rights sexually accessible, one way or three, to their betters. And that's not who's being talked about. Straight down the line, right down to Kavanaugh. Understand, I'll be delighted Kavanaugh doesn't get on the court because there's a little room for maneuver. It's tactical utility to not letting them consummate that right now. And we got a climactic issue, an environmental issue, which really is like a wall we're approaching. So latitude that we've had in terms of redefining interactions with humans, well, the calculus changes a little bit. As you were calling for some sort of organizing cohesion, what are we organizing for? Again, totally lose perspective. We need to step back, take a breath every time something comes up as a burning issue and see if maybe unplug a little bit electronically, you know, and see if we can't figure out some burning issues in concrete terms based on our own lives or in what they're telling us is supposed to be consequential.
Just to keep a thread on the positive and upbeat as far. I actually just wanted to say something, getting back to, and this is just along the same lines of how deep the crisis, that these conversations are not at all about an American or a U.S. or a North American conversation. So they are an Indian conversation, they're an Asian conversation, they're a Pan-African conversation. I did also say that a member of PM Press leadership is in the House, so it's not just to be a good salesperson, but also to just point your attention to a book that came out, and it's actually, the crisis is so deep, it's two volumes this size, and I'm not sure if volume 2 is in the House, although it did just come out, but you know, as we've looked at and are looking at some of the forms for some of these kinds of conversations that have been with us over the last quarter century and less, the World Social Forum, and those spaces becoming more constricted and becoming less effective, some of the folks, especially this one gentleman, Jai Sen, who was in the left wing of that space, put together 2 volumes on the movements of movements to look at a truly international, a truly worldwide perspective on just what you were talking about, the nature of the crisis and how people are trying to define and redefine it.
I wanted to pick up on the earlier questions and ask you about the kind of tactical issues of the contemporary conjuncture, because it does strike me that thus far in the conversation you've at least identified 2 major problems. One is that the groundswell of the 60s and 70s of radical organizing also encountered a massive assault on the part of the state. Churchill's work has documented this in great detail, and that had brutal consequences on that entire generation of organizing and long-term intergenerational consequences. And so while I agree wholeheartedly with the appeal to and the need for revolutionary anti-imperialist organizing today in the contemporary conjuncture, the question that I have is twofold. One is, what can we learn from the counter-revolutionary assault that killed, incarcerated, marginalized, destroyed the lives of so many of the important organizers of that time period? And secondly, and this segues with some of the earlier questions as well, how do we deal with the fact that in the current conjuncture, so much of the orthodox modality of both organizing and the discourse of politics is dominated by liberalism?
Yeah. So if people are not aware of the COINTELPRO papers, that Ward co-authored, and maybe there's some that are not. The fundamental answer to your first part of the question are in those books. So if you don't really understand that repressive context, and you don't have that information, all the stuff I said about the still imprisoned Panthers and others, it all goes back to this very calculated and largely illegal, even to their own standards, activities. Checking out Ward's books, the COINTELPRO papers, two volumes, is the place to go to get an understanding of that.
Well, I'm going to say with regard to the COINTELPRO papers, yeah, you're going to get an inventory of tactics and examples of how it worked in a frame when, as you put it, it was illegal. You have to understand those tactics, that program, retitled, continues. It always has. It was never a counterintelligence program. That's the nature of the cryptonym, actually. It was a counter-subversive or status quo reinforcement that would have to be taken into account. What you will find, I'll give one concrete answer now, because it's something that everybody can address. Our own behaviors rendered COINTELPRO devastatingly effective. I can't just disagree with you tactically, politically, on a given point. If I do, then you plant the rumor. Okay. Often, badjacking properly understood is an infiltrator, a provocateur, casting a bona fide actus in the role, casting suspicion of them as being an infiltrator provocateur.
The fact is, some of us remember though. No, I think what Assanto has said actually speaks deeply to that, and painfully to that as well, because sometimes it means losing friends. And it's complicated. It is complicated because I think in some ways we fight it by out-organizing it, but we've lost a certain amount. I mean, we've been out-organized. We have the Move 9 on your shirt. We have Sundiata Acoli. I know it's the glasses. We have Mutulu Shakur. We have Leonard Peltier. And we have David Gilbert. We have many others. And in them, I think, we have continuous teachers who in some ways have been forced to continue to look deeply at the world and at combating liberalism and working long haul for radical thoughts. Thank you. Thank you.